Welcome to Books of Our Time, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. Today we shall discuss a revisionist book which discusses the German Army in World War II. The book is Cross of Iron by John Mosier, who is a professor of English at Loyola University of New Orleans and is perhaps the leading revisionist historian of the two world wars. Professor Mosier is with me today to discuss his most recent book, and I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. John, thank you for coming up from the Crescent City. It's a long way away. John, you are not professionally a historian, but a professor of English and formerly a film critic. So how did you happen to become not only a historian of the two world wars, but for that matter, in all probability, the leading revisionist historian of the two world wars?
Well, military history was always my first love, but back in the 1960s, there was no degree program that I was aware of, first. And second, getting a degree in English was easy, and that was the job that guaranteed speedy employment, which I was desperately in need of. And I then went into administration and spent a long time basically doing that, and I gave me the opportunity to work on developing some military history courses. When I got totally burned out as a film critic, which is a long story how I got into film critic, but there weren't any film degree programs back then either.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
In fact, the two people who were most influential that I worked with in the United States, one of them had a PhD in political science and was a CPA, and the other had some sort of crackpot degree and was a great drama coach.
Yeah.
So when I finally bailed from administration in 1990, I really wanted to do something, and I was able to really get back into what I had always wanted to do, taught some courses in, and set to work on. So that's where. And actually, Harper, the agents and publishers have this thing about English departments. They think that's some big deal. I tried actually to get them to emphasize the part which has a lot of relevance, which is I was the university's first institutional research officer. And that's really where I learned big time to work with numbers.
Yeah.
And so, which has been very important to my work.
Yeah, we'll get into that a little bit with casualty ratios. It's all very interesting, John, because when you and I were young, as they say, English, for people in English, jobs were hard to come by. Military history was virtually non-existent. It is coming back. Did I say English? I misspoke myself. It's now hard to get a job.
It's impossible.
Right. Yeah. And military history is still not easy, but it's a little better than it was. In any event, John, one of the things you say in Cross of Iron, which is most striking, and there are many very striking things, is that military historians are, quote, impervious to facts. Why do you say that, and what led you to that conclusion?
Well, looking at all the evidence, and then how it leads you in one direction, and it's usually just, I guess impervious is the right word. I wouldn't want to single out just military historians. I think you see, Albert Schweitzer told Velvel, he said basically, you can't tell the French anything. Their notions are all preconceived.
You know what Henry Ford said, by the way? History is bunk. Well, and I never wanted to believe that until I started reading enough to say, well, maybe the guy was onto something.
And I think you see a lot of examples. I wrote my dissertation on historiography, so I was really in epic poetry. So I was really fascinated by how history comes to be written. And people tend to manipulate the facts in order to suit their theses.
Yeah.
Thus we have Columbus, the great rationalist, the only person who knew the world was round. Everybody else thought it was flat.
Yeah. Absolutely untrue.
Absolutely untrue at every level.
Yeah.
And we have the myth of Galileo and the Papal Inquisition turned into a science versus superstition debate.
Isn't it true that all they wanted him to do is not be so vociferous about his beliefs?
Well, actually, there was a lot of opposition from other scientists. Because remember, Galileo's concept was wrong. he thought the orbits were circular, but they're elliptical.
Yeah.
So it's not as though I mean, this is one of these tricky things.
Yeah.
But it's not like they were going to burn him at the stake. In fact,
Yeah.
the Pope really, took pretty good care of him. Galileo, like a lot of people, of geniuses, was a bit of a jerk. So that entered into
Didn't
it.
help.
But that just becomes, that's part and parcel of the Spanish Inquisition. Now, those things have all been thoroughly debunked for decades and decades, and yet they just don't ever go away. So military historians aren't necessarily exempt from that. I think it seems to me that it's worse, and I could give you a sort of scheme of the category problems. Getting away from things.
But just in general, you think the problem is that people have theses and they ignore contrary evidence because they wish to prove their theses.
Yes, I think it's partly deliberately ignoring it. We know that started with the British in the First World War.
Uh-huh.
Okay, the first people who wrote histories, and very good, interesting histories of the war, were employees of the British government's, the part of the British government that was turning out propaganda.
Uh-huh.
So they passed themselves off as journalists, but actually they were government employees.
Yeah.
And they wrote histories. And the British were really onto something, which was to tell enough of the truth to give you credibility.
Right.
And so it's complex lies, and those are the hardest to debunk.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
some of that is also just there. Some of those problems are the result of a kind of Anglo-American provincialism when it comes to research.
Uh-huh.
The editor of a French history journal confessed to me. He said, I really was predisposed to like your book because I just got through reading an American academic study of the French and Indian Wars. It has a 60-page bibliography, and there isn't one work in French
Yeah.
in the bibliography. And one of the things I tried to do...
The point there is that Americans and British historians don't read what the other side has to say.
Well, it's not just the other side, that's true. But in the case of the French, I mean, they were on our side.
Yeah.
But there's a tendency to just ignore their work.
I see. Okay.
And we're talking I don't mean narrative accounts, but for example, we have very high-level diaries and reports inside the French government that were made that have all kinds of revelations about the course of the war. The best technical...
First World War.
First World War.
Yeah.
The best technical accounts we have of tanks and artillery development are from French gunnery experts. And these people, I think, are just unique witnesses because they were in the war, they were experts in their field, and they had very responsible positions. The inspector of artillery, for example.
You were telling me before we went on that the French were actually developing tanks before the British. People think the British invented it and used it first at Cambrai. Maybe there was the first use of tanks on the Western Front, but you say the French were developing them.
Well, the French were developing them. There were lots of technical problems. Actually, the first real use was on the Somme in September of 1916. The French were opposed to that because they thought of it as a surprise weapon. The first real serious use of it was in April 1917 by the French, which was a disaster. But the French actually had the first large-scale deployment and the first real serious successes. One of the problems about Cambrai being impervious to fact, you can't really call a battle a victory if 48 hours after you stopped, all of your tanks were out of action and the Germans had taken over all of your trench lines from whence you launched the attack and thrown you back to the next line. Calling that a victory is sort of like blowing the whistle, at the time that's most convenient. And that's what I mean by imperviousness. And there are tons of examples like that, unfortunately.
You say that one great difference between the Germans at the beginning of World War II on the one hand and the French and British on the other is that the Germans remembered the lessons of World War I, and you say the British and the French did not. And you further say that the lessons that the Germans remembered were fundamentally lessons of victory for the German army. not the defeat, which was at the end of the war. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, you have to start off with this thing that in the German point of view, from the German point of view, right up until they asked President Wilson for an armistice, they were doing very well. They had realized after the Americans came in that, and von Hindenburg said, we realized we couldn't win the war any longer, but we certainly...
Can I interrupt something?
Yes.
There is you quote an interview of a now dead but once famous journalist with Hindenburg, which you say was lost to history, in which Hindenburg says, we got out of that war because the Americans were coming in and they just had too much manpower.
Yes. Well, and he also said very specifically, which is that the real key to success, the reason we decided to quit, was the success of American troops in the Argonne.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is significant because he was interviewed basically in November 1918. The interview was never published, and the guy who did it was threatened with all sorts of things. He later published it in a book called, related to, like, all the news that didn't get printed, basically. But you can see why the interview was suppressed, because it doesn't fit the convenient model. But then that whole model was a bogus model to begin with. When defeated armed, then when the war quit, the Germans and the Austrians were all on enemy territory. They didn't run. They marched home with their weapons intact and set the stage for the next stage of the fighting. So from their point of view, they felt that they had been militarily successful almost all the time, which was really true. And they really, therefore, had absorbed some lessons. The problem with the Allies was that, by and large, they lied to themselves about about what had happened.
John, tell me two things. One, explain to the audience about the casualty exchange ratios, which, of course, support the thesis that the German army had been vastly more successful than the British and French armies, and explain what the lessons were that the Germans took with them and applied at the beginning of the Second World War.
Well, to answer the questions in reverse order, the thing the Germans had learned, which was really important, was speed. That the power of an army that moves quickly, and speed was a function of decentralization, which means you've got to let your lower commanders do what they want. And the Germans had also learned the importance of firepower as opposed to manpower. They just expanded that in the Second World War because they realized those were the keys to victory. The casualty exchange ratio is very complicated, but if you sort through it all, basically what you come up with is that overall, counting every combatant everywhere, the Allies had 5 men killed for every 3 Central Powers soldiers. And I'm not the only one saying that. But the data, most of the data comes from British documents, and the official documents. This is not, I'm guessing. And on the Western Front, the ratio is somewhere between 1 to 4 and 2 to 4. Now we can quibble about various ways of counting, but there are basically a million British personnel killed in almost all of them in Europe.
Yeah.
Okay, 1.4 something, nearly 1.5 million French soldiers killed in combat and missing, presumed dead. 1 point, basically a million Germans maybe buried dead.
Yeah.
2.5 to 1.
Yeah. And plus,
and the guy who wins the casualty exchange, is doing something right.
Yeah, and of course the Germans absolutely smashed the Russian armies on the Eastern Front in the First World War. So the casualty exchange ratios were, even as I understand, much higher there.
Yes, they were. They did. And of course the problem there is everybody uses the figure of 1.7 million Russian war dead, but that's like, let's just pull numbers out of a hat. We don't know.
Yeah. We'll get back to Russian war dead when we talk a little more about World War II and the Eastern Front. You also mentioned that part of the Germans' institutional memory of the First World War was even after they had marched back into Germany because they had agreed to an armistice, there were more wars that went on. One was a civil war within Germany.
Yes.
And one was a war in the Baltic, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, I guess. And there was such a thing, which Americans don't generally know of, called the Freikorps, and the Germans won those wars. Well, in Germany it was a civil war, but the Freikorps won the war there. Why don't you elaborate on all of that? Freikorps, the Civil War, the Baltic Wars, and that being part of the German memory.
Well, part of that was that there, of course, were ethnic Germans in all those areas. But once the Bolshevik Revolution triumphed, those areas, Finland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, that had historically been countries but were now part of the Romanov Empire, those people wanted their independence. There were ethnic Germans there who wanted independence from Russia, if not necessarily local autonomy. Then there were communists who wanted to had territorial aims. Mm-hmm. And in fact, a lot of those people had fought in the German army. There was a special unit of German infantry that was composed exclusively of Finnish soldiers who were instrumental in the Finnish drive to freedom. There was just a knockdown, drag-out, horrifying struggle that went on as those countries tried to get their independence and shifting alliances with ethnic Germans. The communists tried to take over Germany proper. That was where Lenin had felt the best situation was for
Rosa Luxemburg and all those people?
Yes, that's right. And they started through armed revolution. They formed a very short-lived Socialist Republic of Bavaria, of Munich. Now, and the leader of the German post-Kaiser state was a social democrat. He was a socialist, in other words.
Reuter?
Ebert.
Okay.
But they saw what had happened to Kerensky in Russia, who was busily trying to get search warrants and be legal while the communists were doing. And so they decided they weren't going to do that. The Freikorps basically were, first they were spontaneously formed groups of military personnel who had returned from the front.
With their weapons.
Who then were simply drafted into the newly formed German Army of the Republic. Those units, when you read references to them in English, they're talked about as though they were just bands of hoodlums.
Yeah.
If you look at the organizational charts and the names, these were full-scale divisional operations with tanks and artillery and airplanes.
Yeah.
And there were regular officers from the German army who were assigned to those commands, the most famous being Heinz Guderian. Mm-hmm. There's no secret. He listed it in his Vita when he published his memoirs.
The famous German tank commander.
Yeah, the famous German tank commander. So those wars went on, and of course, and it gets very complicated, but everybody's fighting everybody. But essentially, what that gave, the positive side was that reinforced the belief of the German military that they could beat anybody no matter how outnumbered they were.
Yeah. We in America, our historians, well, as you say, they describe the Freikorps as a bunch of hoodlums. To me, the central point might be that for practical purposes, we ignore all of that stuff in our history, just like Americans ignore and don't realize that we were part of an invasion of Russia at Murmansk right after the 1917 revolution, which the Russians have never forgotten.
No, that's a real source point. Another triumph of Wilsonian diplomacy. But the point is that if your the whole claim that the British, French, and particularly Wilson really rested on was, we have peace. Don't bitch about what we've done. We've given peace.
Yeah.
So the fact that there isn't really peace, except in America, that ask the Irish, what they did the fighting stop in 1918?
Yeah.
No,
yeah.
It didn't stop in Central Europe. The Romanians tried to take over Hungary.
Yeah.
There's violence everywhere. Well, but it's a very inconvenient fact. It's just like the claim that the Alsace was French.
Yeah. Now we have another minute or two before we have to go to break, and I never follow these things closely, so I would like you to elaborate on a point you make, which is fairly well revisionist, and not perhaps quite as revisionist as some others, but you say that the early German successes in World War II were largely a product of Hitler's shrewd, wicked though he was, and evil though he was, his shrewd assessments of the psyches of his opponents whom he knew would, if I might use an obnoxious current term, cut and run, that they would quickly give up. Explain this a little bit.
Well, on the first thing that struck me was that we have a whole series of capitulations, the Dutch being the first, and then
the Dutch generals objected.
Yes, the Dutch army felt, and in fact, if you look at this data, it's true they were overrun, but it's sort of like the Finns with the Russians in '39 and then the Winter War. You can do so much damage to the enemy that he leaves you the hell alone.
Yeah, Pyrrhic victory. Yeah.
Yes, and the French government's panicked phone call to Churchill in May 15th. It really was cut and run.
That was Reynaud, the French premier?
Yes, who called Churchill. Everything's run. And as I got the French general who was on the spot, I think the quote really sums it up. He says, every war has its routes. This is one of them. Okay. We forget because we have this fictitious history of the First World War. But in August 1914, the end of August 1914, okay, half the French army was south of the Seine.
Yeah.
Okay. The British Expeditionary Headquarters was to the southwest of Paris.
Yeah.
Okay. The Germans were way far along, and the British commander wanted to cut and run.
Excuse me. That's by way of saying much of France had been taken over.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. So the idea that this was new, the French had been there before. French officers had been there before.
Yeah. But they didn't have a Joffre Gallieni this time.
No, they didn't, because in 1914 the authority of the two senior officers in the French army was almost absolute, and they were determined to fight it out. Kitchener was important. He went to France and he told Sir John French, you cannot pull out even if it means losing the whole expeditionary force, because then the whole thing will collapse.
Yeah, yeah.
And that they did lose the whole expeditionary force, but they didn't quit.
And this time the English drew back to the Channel, which in a certain sense, being Churchill, the bulldog par excellence, maybe that's surprising, but they drew back to Dunkirk. The Belgian flank was open. The Germans just wiped everybody out.
Well, what they really did was they withdrew without bothering to tell anybody they were withdrawing is the real sin. And by doing that, they doomed the Belgian army, which, contrary to what they later tried to say, the Belgian army the Belgians had learned from World War I.
Yeah.
Okay, they were fairly well armed. They were well equipped. They had a sizable army, and they fought. But the king, when he realized what had happened to him, he felt that he couldn't sacrifice the entire country.
Yeah, yeah.
Whether that's right or wrong,
Yeah.
But the Belgians found themselves in an untenable position owing to the British retreat at Dunkirk.
Yeah, yeah. We'll come back and discuss that just a bit more, including the theory that the bomber will always get through and what that means and how it affected what people were thinking as soon as we come back from this break, which we're going to take now. Stay with us. We'll be back in just a moment with Professor John Mosier. Welcome back. John, it's a little known fact, which you've told me is only now beginning, or in recent years beginning to be broadcast, that the French actually won some very large tank battles against the Wehrmacht before France was conquered. Where did that happen, and why has it been lost to history? Oh, by the way, and they lost 100,000 dead. People say the French didn't fight. Well, 100,000 dead, that's 33 times what we've lost in Iraq so far.
Well, the French fought. In fact, if you look at the northeastern France, is dotted with sort of last stand type monuments. Yes, the first big tank battle of the Second World War was in the area Gembloux in Belgium. The so-called French Cavalry Corps, which basically was a mechanized and armored division, tangled with two German panzer divisions. And tactically probably won. At the same time, then there was one further south as the French tried to stop the breakthrough at Sedan, in which French heavy tanks just rampaged through the German lines. Those things happened. The reason that they have been ignored was basically that everybody wanted May 1940 to be over. The British didn't want anybody realizing that they had bailed. First they tried to blame the Belgians, and when that didn't work, the whole idea was the French just collapsed and cut and ran. The Gaullists, who started Free France, wanted to disgrace the old republic. Pétain and Vichy didn't want people to realize that they could have fought on longer than they did. So it was just a very convenient conspiracy. I found out about this basically through local French history of people who don't trust the government, so they write their own stuff.
Sounds like Americans these days.
Well, it's a very basic, it's a very important part about understanding documents and archival research in France. Nobody in France has ever trusted the government. Everybody who had something to say printed and published what he found and made an argument from it. But the first real serious book in France on this only came out in, I think, June of 2005. That details a lot of these things.
And actually, the first time I read about it was in a book that came out sometime around 2000 or 2001 in the United States. So the French, they fought a fairly significant war there for a while before it was finally over.
Yes.
They
could have won.
Pardon me?
They could have won.
Yeah. Now that's an interesting point, which you can explain perhaps in connection with the following question.
Okay.
Everybody thinks that the Germans won because they developed this new form of warfare called blitzkrieg, which relied on heavily mechanized forces. And you point out that not only was this not a new form of warfare, but that they were, I think one can adjectively say, vastly inferior to the French, the Russians, and the Czechs in terms of tanks.
Oh, yeah. Yes, the German tank development is just mythological when the accounts of it. It's a very sad story, basically, self-contradictory. Everybody takes Guderian's comments in his memoir at face value. They're very self-serving. He had never seen a tank until he saw an old one in Sweden in 1930. The French tanks were designed for defensive warfare because the French government's official policy was defensiveness. So it was important for them to be heavily armored. So therefore they were slower, but they were very, very reliable. The French had done very long-term tests. And contrary to what a lot of British writers have said, France emerged from the First World War with tons of money. They had enough money to build fortifications, to build a new navy, to build an air force, and to build a tank force. They had a sizable tank force. Some of the tanks were old because the French never throw anything away. But their basic tank was essentially a superior version of the Grant tank. I say superior because it had the same hull-mounted potent gun, but it was much lower profile, and it was French tanks, which were cast steel, were so heavily armored that as German anti-tank gunners discovered, their shells just bounced off. And we have surviving examples. It's just like it took basically a direct shot from the high velocity German anti-aircraft gun.
The German tanks, you say, until about 43 or 44, were really vastly inferior.
Oh yes, the Russians had excellent tanks, not just the T-34, but the earlier versions, and that's why I think, by the way, these remarks about how the T-34 was such a surprise. It's like the tanks the Russians deployed in the Spanish Civil War were a lot better than anything the Germans had. They had a much more high-velocity gun.
So fundamentally, you're taking the position that it was the mental set of the politicians that caused the disaster at the inception of World War II, because they did just say, we want no part of this war. Now, let me ask you two questions about that, if I may. People, maybe it's three questions. People often say that the horrendous casualties of World War I played a role in that. And people say that the false theory that the bomber will A, always get through, and B, will wreak havoc also had a role. What do you think about those two ideas?
Well, everybody bought into this air power theories that were developed in the late 20s by the British independently of Douay, the Italian, but he gets all the credit. It got to the point where it made a lot of foreign policy moves almost impossible, particularly for the British and French, because we have a British Prime Minister standing up and saying, in the event of war, London will be turned to rubble in a few days, if not a few hours.
Was that Chamberlain?
No, actually, this was not Chamberlain. This was Baldwin.
Baldwin?
So with that kind of idea, we can't do anything because, we're being bombed. Various factors kind of combined together to do that. The Spanish Civil War, Guernica and, of course, Barcelona tended to support that theory.
But there was no anti-aircraft defense in those wars.
Well, that's right.
By the Republicans.
Because basically what happened was there was strategic bombing in the First World War.
Yeah.
The British, the French, and the Germans all tried it. The Germans were the only people who really looked at it seriously and realized that it doesn't work very well because you have very high levels of plane loss.
Yeah.
So German doctrine said, okay, the Air Force is totally tactical.
Right.
It's in support of ground troop objectives. The British and the French went the other way. The Air Force is a separate branch of the service.
Yeah, and they didn't realize that once you started getting vast anti-aircraft defense batteries and fighter pursuit planes, hey, this was for the first few years, they were knocking the U.S. and the Air Force and the RAF out of the skies faster than we could put it up there virtually.
And the Germans, it's one of those things, if the Germans, therefore, turned to the Air Force, the German Air Force was actually in charge of ground-to-air defenses.
Yeah.
So the only real serious, well, there were two, but the two really serious advantages the Germans had militarily at the start of the war were they were the only people who had an integrated ground-to-air defense system that went at the battalion level and regimental level, and they were the only people who had effective tactical air power. The Germans had thought about this. Anybody could have built, the Japanese, the French, and the Americans all had dive bombers, but they were all done by the Navy.
Yeah.
The Germans were the only people who had effective dive bombers. And so the whole idea, which the British really had and the French, was that level flight tactical bombing that's fine, that will work. And of course, it's suicide.
Yeah. Now, one of the reasons that the Germans, I think you say in your book, that the Germans were able to make such tremendous strides by taking over Czechoslovakia, the Anschluss with Austria, on into Poland, actually, was that the Allies had come more or less to implicitly agree with the Germans that Versailles had been a terrible one-sided treaty, and the Germans have been treated very badly after that. So there was kind of a sense, well, maybe they've got a point here. Is that accurate?
I think so. I think there's an evolution. And of course now, I mean, appeasement. Chamberlain gave it really ruined it. It's a term. But actually, the idea.
A bad name.
Yeah, but the idea that the other guy has just complaints, and if you let those be met, he'll back off. And actually, ironically, Hitler's the whole point about the chronology of what happened to Czechoslovakia, which is the tipping point for the general population.
Yes.
Okay, in a very strange way, Hitler is not the bad guy there. He certainly can't complain that he gets the credit for it, but actually, Czechoslovakia was cracking up. And we tend to forget, everybody that wrote after 45, between 45 and 89, acts as though this was one country. The first thing that happened after the Russians pulled out was the Slovaks wanted a divorce. They've been trying to get a divorce since 1919.
If I may summarize this, Czechoslovakia as a country was much like the Balkans or Iraq. It was a bunch of different people.
It was yes, it was. And there was a substantial community of ethnic Germans who'd been there since nobody knows how long, but they'd been there a long time, 4 million of them. There was a big group of Slovaks. So one of the ideas, and I see it constantly being trotted out, is that if the Allies had just stiffened up because the Czechs would have fought. That's just not true. The Slovaks had the ethnic Germans weren't going to fight. The Slovaks had already said, they wanted, in fact, the Slovaks really precipitated this because they declared their independence, and that actually led to the collapse of what was left of the Czech Republic.
Yeah.
So, it was politics.
Yeah.
And then afterwards, everyone changed his mind. The other problem with Poland at first, the Poles were, in a sense, were very smart. They didn't trust Wilson and the victors. The Polish army, newly created, established Poland on military terms in 1919, 1920, okay? But Poland's concept of Poland was a lot bigger than what the Allies thought it should be. It included big chunks of Lithuania and Western Ukraine, which the Poles tried to Polonize according to. So yeah, there were a lot of complex factors there that led particularly the British to simply say,
throw up their hands.
To hell with it.
John, while Hitler's overall strategic sense, at the beginning of the war at least, until he made a couple of phenomenal mistakes regarding Russia and the United States, while it was his strategic sense, his shrewd guesses, call it what you will, that had a major impact, he also had an officer corps which you describe as being tactically very good, albeit strategically imbecilic. Why don't you explain how that officer corps came about and what were the hallmarks of the strategic imbecility and the tactical competence?
Well, the tactical competence, the best summary of it was Field Marshal Montgomery's briefings to British officers. And he would say, the reason the Germans are so good is their officers have a tremendous sense of the terrain. And they're very quick. You cannot give them a moment's break. They will just come back and roll over you. That's the tactical part. And the local officers, they're trained to do that. And by this time, it was in their blood. The strategic imbecility comes in when you see some of the plans that they actually came up with. The original plan that they had come up with for May 1940 was the same plan as they had used in 1914, except it wasn't as good and they didn't have the superiority. The successive plans were just ridiculous. Yeah. Now, some of this is passive aggressive, but a lot of it is that when the German officer corps was formed, the new army, the man who created it, if you look, he had thousands and thousands of combat trained officers.
Von Siegt.
Von Siegt, yes. Von Siegt, it looks like that what he really was after was, first of all, he wanted to pick Easterners, and he wanted to pick
because Germany had always this Eastern Front and this Western Front.
He wanted, yes. Yeah. The Easterners had been untouched by the Ludendorff-Falkenhayn debacle. He wanted to pick Easterners, and he looks like he also wanted to pick people who were at some level in the right social group.
Right.
The pre-war German army, contrary to what people said, I mean, people like Max Hoffman, who was usually, the Brits will tell you, the great strategic genius of the First World War, and regardless of what we think of Ludendorff, he was a very talented guy. These were not aristocratic Prussians.
Yeah.
Okay. And in fact, their behavior. Hoffman spent most of his time before the war drunk. Ludendorff was chasing other men's wives. And there's also the fact that having to deal with the Kaiser, which was a special issue, it sort of broadened their views of the world, and it gave them a sense of strategy.
But this got lost, I think.
And it got lost.
Yeah.
And what you have is a bunch of guys who, and they're just in awe of Hitler. I mean, it's very strange.
What do you think they would have done? I mean, you point out that this was so pronounced that Rommel, who is regarded as this great genius, suggested in 1943 that one way to disarm the world's distaste for Hitler's treatment of the Jews is put a Jew in high government circles. My God, they were putting him in concentration camps. This is crazy.
That's right.
What difference would it have made if they had retained a strategic sense?
Well, I think if they had retained that sense to a great extent, they would have. I mean, senior German officers were very good at handling the Kaiser. Kaiser Wilhelm was not, as is often said, crazy. He wasn't in control. He had serious post-birth trauma of very serious kinds. And it was like he had a serious head injury.
Yeah.
He was fairly easy to manage. And contrary to what people say, the army took great pains to.
Could they have controlled Hitler?
Yes. So I'm saying I think the same thing could have been employed.
Okay. So
now maybe not as successfully.
They might have told Hitler, "Don't invade Russia. This is a disaster in the making."
Well, they were very, you know, people in courtiers are very successful at passive aggressive behavior. You have this great thing with when the great non-existent conference that the Kaiser calls because he's decided that the war is going to break out. We have to plan. The Navy has to do this. The Army has to do this. He summons these guys. They're all sitting there listening to him. And the minutes of the conversation are just hilarious because you can see these are people who've been called into a meeting by their boss. They can't tell him that he's full of it, and they can't really disagree with him. So they resort to the classical strategy. Oh, yes, this is a great idea. We're all ready, but I don't think these guys over here are really up to this. You know, it goes around the table. And as the man who kept the minutes of the meeting said despondently, and so the result of this was practically zero.
Yeah, which you think is what would have happened.
Yes, and I think we could have seen more of that with Hitler.
Yeah. We have to go to break. We'll be back. When we come back, I would like to discuss two things. One, your views of the Eastern Front, and two, the remarkable fact that there were a significant component of men of Jewish descent in Hitler's Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht. An amazing thing. Stay with us. We'll be right back for the final segment with John Mosier, a revisionist historian of World War II. Welcome back. John, when I was a kid growing up and watching movies in the late 40s and early 50s, war movies, the propaganda always was that the U.S. Army won the war in Europe all by itself. Russia? Nobody knew from Russia, so to speak. Now, things have really switched these days for various reasons. The Red Army is often given the lion's share of the credit for the victory on land. And there are reasons, I guess, the tremendous losses it suffered, the drive to Berlin from the western parts of Russia. But you don't see it that way at all. You don't see it in the revisionist way at all. You want to revise the revisionism, I guess it would be fair to say. Tell us your views about Stalin's tactics and the import of American industrialism and Hitler's failure to understand our capacity.
Well, I think in the first instance you have to understand that one of the things that happened was this Soviet government was just terrific at making numbers up. And they started off by giving a very low figure, lowballing the figure for the war dead. And then when they realized it was really to their advantage along the lines you said to boost it, they started boosting it.
You mean they boosted it after the war?
Oh, yes. Yes, at first they were basically saying, 4 or 5 million or 6, 7, 8, and then they realized, oh, well, we can get a lot of mileage out of the suffering.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
It's normally accepted these days that the Russian war debt of all for civilians and was around 20 million. I've recently heard it might be 60 million, as high as 60 million.
Well, the problem is that we got to count. When do you start counting? You've got the Great Famine. You've got the terror before the Great Terror, and it's like trying to figure out how many people were murdered in the Operation Reinhardt camps. The Germans didn't count, so you have to use census data, and that's a very dodgy way of estimating things. Okay. But I think my sense is that the Russian figures now that are in the low 20s. Okay. But of course, then we've got all these other people. We've got tens of millions of people who'd already died before then. So, but everything we knew about how this war was fought really came from two sources. First of all, the Soviet government's official line, and secondly, the rather self-serving memoirs of German generals who were trying to clear themselves and say, oh, yes, it was a terrible mistake. We were against it all along. It never should have happened. So it's only recently when we had this brief opening of the archives that we've seen enough hard data to begin to suspect otherwise.
Otherwise meaning?
Otherwise, that the Red Army was not nearly as successful as it was claimed.
Well, you say in that regard that Stalin's fundamental tactic, like the Japanese plans for kamikaze attacks, even on land, which that's called banzai.
Yeah, right.
That his fundamental tactics constituted an order to commit mass suicide throughout the war.
Well, that's essentially the case. I mean, in fact, one of the reasons that it didn't get noticed, it was like Saddam Hussein's famous armored thrust south at the start of Gulf War I, which had everybody puzzled. What's he doing? What's he doing? That was his assault. But it was so pathetic that nobody paid any attention to it.
Yeah.
We had a bunch of Marines, basically, and the same thing happened with a lot of the Russian maneuvers at the start of the first couple of years of the war. They kept on attacking. The Germans didn't really realize that this was what they were doing because they were so unsuccessul.
It was so crazy, they couldn't believe this was their tactic.
But the other point is, if you don't really care how many men you lose, there's in fact, the kamikaze Japanese attacks did us a lot of damage. And MacArthur, who knew the Japanese very well, told his men, his commanders in the Pacific, don't let the Japanese attack you. If you attack them, you've got the advantage. But if they attack you, because they will just pile up the dead, and we're not used to dealing with that kind of fighting.
Now, because of these mass suicidal attacks, which caused the Russians to lose about 2 million men in the first 3 months, and 3 million by the end of 1 year, and 4 million by the end of 2 years, maybe even more than 4 million, I've recently read. You think that the Russians would have lost the war by the summer of 43 or the year 44, except for the vast, massive American resupply, which you'll say was Hitler's other fundamental miscalculation of the war?
Well, yeah, the amount of Lend-Lease aid that we shipped over, which the Soviet Union very blandly, of course, denied, had any real impact. But come on, that's ridiculous. Yes, that was instrumental. But the other thing, of course, was that although the Russians kept claiming we weren't opening a second front, we did open second fronts. And the Germans had to divert basically 500,000 men to Italy. Now, that was a disaster for the Allies. But if you look at the troops they had to divert there and in various other theaters, and you say, what would have happened if those men had been sent into action on the Eastern Front? They would have made a tremendous difference.
It's also considered, now I know that you believe, and we have discussed, that air power, strategic air power, was largely a failure, and I think that's a pretty widely accepted view these days, but...
Except by the British. Except by the British. But it did tie up thousands of German 88s, which would have been used otherwise possibly on the East, and 1 million men. Yeah, but the problem is, first of all, gun tubes are easy to make. The complicated, expensive part is when you take the gun and you have to put it on a mobile platform and shield it and armor it and train a gun crew. If you have it mounted on a flak tower, and you can have a gun crew that consists basically of 11-year-old kids and 80-year-old guys, because they don't have to move around; they're just staying there. So for the Germans, I think the opportunity cost was very low. And you see, the horrible thing that people don't want to talk about, but we did kill basically somewhere, I don't know, 350,000 German civilians during the bombing. But in a sense, those were people Hitler had been trying to get rid of anyway. The old, the sick, the lame, the burden on society. In a very bizarre, ghastly way, we actually were making Germany much more efficient, because you didn't have to worry about those people. They all got incinerated. Well, there were various reasons, but we never really did, until near the very end of the war, we never really did damage German production, oil, aircraft, anything. Well, the big claim, by the way, which is, this is a good example of impervious to facts. The reason the Germans ran out of oil was in August 1944, the Red Army overran all the oil fields in Romania. So when the OSS claimed at the end, that the raw materials, the Germans ran out of raw materials because of the strategic bombing campaign at the end of 1944, it's like, no, they ran out of raw materials because Allied troops were sitting on all of them. That would have happened if we hadn't dropped a single bomb. And our opportunity cost, when you look and see, in the Pacific, MacArthur kept saying, he was a big convert, he kept saying, air power, air power, air power, air. He meant tactical. Air power, air power, air. That's the key. And the Americans in the Far East under MacArthur, really had mastered tactical air power. They just could pound the Japanese into oblivion. Well, if we had been able to, and Montgomery was successful at doing that on a lesser scale in North Africa. If that had ever been done systematically and with the resources we were throwing into the strategic bomb, that's an opportunity cost. That's what I mean.
Yeah. There was this famous bombing, use of heavy bombers to break out at Normandy, and boy, you read about that and you think if that had been done all the time, my God.
Well, if the Air Force had been forced to actually pay attention and do it, but you know, they were really they were convinced that strategic bombing was that was it. That was the way to do it.
Yeah. I want to talk for the remaining 4 minutes or so, John, about one of the most shocking of all things that you say, but there is a prior book, Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, which first discussed this. Why don't you describe the extent to which Jews were part and parcel of Hitler's military, and indeed very high indeed, second and third in command of the Luftwaffe?
Well, yeah, contrary to what people believe, Jewish men of Jewish descent, we'll just call them Jews, okay, various components, had always been in the German army as active officers and reserve officers. Not very many, but there weren't very many Jews in Germany to begin with. The German army had high status. They stayed in the armed forces. There were many of them in there post-war. They were very talented. Goering solved this problem with the Air Force by simply refalsifying their birth certificates, so they were now declared, so they weren't Jews. But yes, when Ernst Udet killed himself after the failure of the Luftwaffe, in his suicide note, he explicitly said the reasons for the failure of the Luftwaffe is it's run by a cabal of senior Jewish officers, and Milch being the best example. That's really true. Why did these guys stay in? First of all, because they really thought of themselves as Germans, and second of all, because they wanted to protect their family members, and we know that was the case. And at the same time, in a really bizarre fashion, just as Goering was falsifying birth certificates, there was a process by which you could get yourself declared Aryanized. People applied, and Hitler approved it. So, but yes, it's one of the most bizarre, and the numbers are substantial. We're not talking about 10 or 15 or 20 guys who got drafted. We're talking about a reasonable echelon of high-ranking officers and a substantial proportion of the officer corps in general, because intermarriages between ethnic Germans and Jewish people had been going on at the 30% level by this time for probably like 50 or 60 years at least. That's a lot of people.
And many of them had one or more Jewish grandparents. A few even had two Jewish parents, like the guy who was number 1 or 2 in the Air Force.
Yeah, sure. Oh, yeah.
Absolutely staggering. And also you point out the German Army demanded to select the Air Force, the German military, demanded to select people in its own way on the basis of competence, having seen what the French did before World War I. And it's if the guy's competent by its lights, that's who
that's one of the reasons. And a lot of this was just turf wars, of which, by the way, Hitler and the Army, particularly the Navy, got in knockdown, screaming fights about. The military really felt at the high level, sure, it's all political. Who's Minister of War, who's Chief of Staff, gets down to there. This is the military's prerogative. We decide who's an officer and who isn't. And on whatever criteria we want to use, and we just butt out. The Army before 1933 and after was the least part of society, German society, that was National Socialist. Very few National Socialist officers.
Well, a lot of these people were at very high level. They may not have been the highest political level, but they were right under, like
guys who made things happen.
The assistant to the chief of staff or something like that.
People who made things happen. Particularly, and ironically, the Luftwaffe, which was going to be the most National Socialist arm of the military. That's what makes it even better. More ironic.
We have 1 minute, and in that 1 minute, John, why don't you just tell people why you think that the Wehrmacht, for all the claims to the contrary in recent decades, the Wehrmacht was really guilty of a huge number of war crimes, and what happened to the Wehrmacht that caused it to break with the German tradition of military honor and be guilty of these war crimes?
Well, I think, first of all, it's the experiences of the dirty war. It's 1919, 20, 21, 22. It really gave them a taste for it. It justified it. The National Socialist ideology was, in that sense, was very feudal and permissive, so there was no rigid chain of command. The thing that got me was that these things happened, everybody knew they'd happened. In a normal military situation, pre-1914, 1918, those guys would have been court-martialed. Okay? So you can get away with it. Part of it is, I think, a normal tendency of men in uniform with guns to do things that they need to be told not to do, and officers at some level just stopped. I think that's true in many armies, but here there was this, Hitler had really broken up the hierarchy that kept that, to a certain extent, kept it in control. I don't think it was necessarily, and that's one of the examples I chose, I don't think it was necessarily dictated by racial ideology.
Yeah, yeah.
They killed too many people who were in the same group.
Yeah, and you know, as you point out, then we have to wrap it up, but as you point out, they did it to uniformed captives whom the people they had captured from other armies in uniform, and they did it throughout the war. They did it on the Eastern Front, they did it on the Western Front.
Started in September 1939. The clearest violation, that's the one I stuck with. You cannot shoot uniformed prisoners of war of another army when they surrender.
Yeah.
Okay, that's just, you just can't do that.
Yeah.
You know.
John, we have to wrap it up. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Appreciate it greatly. To the audience, be with us again for the next episode of Books of Our Time.